This is Groundeffected. My name is your dad, and in this video, I'm gonna paint Homelander, sponsored to me by 3Dverse Studios. Most YouTubers start a video with a lot of drivel before they get to the meat of the video, and I'm not gonna do that, so if you click like and subscribe, I'll get straight to painting this thing right now. On this model there is a couple of spotlights around the base that I personally felt like if I put a light in them, it would make this model just a little bit cooler. So the first thing I did after printing the model is I cut out a hole in the middle of the base so that I could actually get access to the inside of the model and put the battery inside of there. Now obviously there was some supports that I needed to remove before any of this was possible. And you may notice that the base was printed in clear and the rest of the parts in grey. There is nothing to this at all. Honestly, the only reason that I did this was because I had a load of clear resin spare left over. I used some very thin wire to go through the inside of very tiny holes that I had made in the spotlights when I sliced them originally. I also used some very bright LEDs and wired these up as correctly as I possibly could to the inside of those spotlights. Once I had got them all wired up, it was just a matter of placing them into the spaces that was provided by the sculptor already, and then testing that my wiring was not cockeyed. Once I was certain that it was all wired up the way that I needed it to be, it was time to paint this bad boy. Don't forget, you need to mask off anything that you put LEDs in, because otherwise you're gonna have a bad time. Now I used a Citadel black primer for pretty much everything on this model because it's very good. I don't know why it's good. I like it. It flattens very nicely and it honestly gives such a great base to start painting on after you've primed your model. Now don't tell me that I'm a shill for it. It's not that. It's just the fact that it works really well. There is other paints I'm going to be testing out in the future, and when I do, I will let you know about that. Of course, getting back to painting this model, I needed to give the base nothing too crazy to look at because the main feature of this model is the good old Homelander who's standing on top of the base. So for the base, I gave it a dry brush of dark silver over everything pretty much, and I gave a grey dry brush over the little statues that are on the side of the base. Once I was satisfied with everything, I gave all of this a wash with a black panel liner over everything just to dull it down a little bit and make sure the cracks and creases were nice and dark. I then used deck tan, which is slightly off-white, to base coat over the little piece at the bottom of the statues on the side, as well as the V that is on the front of the base. After painting the wings gold, I came back with a red and painted that over the V. I used white first because that way the red would be more brighter than if I went over a black base. Sponsor! This video was sponsored by 3Dverse Studios, and I must say super special thank you for 3Dverse Studios to sponsor this video. What is 3Dverse Studios? They are a Patreon over on Patreon, and you can get 4 models a month every single month if you subscribe to the first tier they have available. The second tier I think is only $18, and you can sell the prints that you print from this Patreon, and I want to thank them for sponsoring this video. Of course, if you like the model that I'm currently painting in this video, then go check out the Patreon. There will be a link for them in the description down below. Make sure to check it out. Let's get straight back to painting the Homelander from 3Dverse Studios. Now for the rest of the model, as I said, I base coated everything in black first, and then I used a white over the top as almost a zenithal highlight. Well, basically it was just a zenithal highlight, and this was to give a little bit of shape to the parts that I'm going to be painting. Using that same red, which I'm pretty sure is Ball Red, which is a contrast paint and is basically transparent, almost. It's not very transparent, but it is bright, and I sprayed that over the zenithal parts of the boots and the gloves. And to give that a little bit more depth and shadow, I used some Caribou Crimson from the bottom through the airbrush to make some shadows. I zenithal the rest of the body, and you can see my very conventional way of drawing things is to just pretty much hang them up on any spot that I can stick these little peg things into. As for his cape, let's not talk about capes. I really don't like capes, but I did a zenithal over that too. And am I the only one who vacuums the spray out of the air booth when you spray it, or am I just crazy? Going back onto the body, I then used blue over the top of everything. It's Talisar blue, which is again a contrast paint, and I used an ink this time to give that some shadow. Once that had fully dried, I turned down the pressure on my compressor and I put some Drakenhof Nightshade, which is a dark blue wash from Citadel, into my airbrush and very carefully pinpointed that into some darker areas that I wanted to highlight. But not highlight, low light, but highlight that they were low lighted. Never mind. For the belt, I painted that with the same deck tan that I used for the other things earlier, and then I used red over the top. I don't know if you noticed that there is a recurring pattern of which I am painting white before I ever paint red, because red doesn't go down very easy. Also, for the golds, halfway through this model, I decided I'm going to try something different, and I'm going to use this paint that I found from Montana. It's basically a spray paint, but the problem is it doesn't paint down very well. So I started out trying to paint it on. It doesn't work as well as you'd think. So what I ended up doing was taking bronze from Monument Hobbies and painting that first, because the coverage is really good, and as a shadow color for the Montana paint, it's actually really good. So when you paint that down first, this covers up and makes sure that everything is tidy, and then you use that Montana paint over the top to make it look like it's shiny gold. It's magic. This is the gold. This, I think, is the way I'm going to do gold forever. Going back to doing white before I do red, you will notice that in this part I painted white before I then painted red. Recurring. This is a recurring thing. Always paint white before you paint red. That's the rules, bruh. Luckily this time I didn't have to paint white before I painted red, because the cape had already been zenithalled. I also used a bit of white to really push the zenithal highlight on it, because I was leaving the stripes that are white to just basically stay white. I wanted to add a bit of white to them so that they weren't just a zenithal and not nice and smooth and airbrushed, because the aerosol gives horrible mark. Never mind. I used the biggest brush that I have, and I try to make the straightest lines I could ever paint, ever. They weren't straight, but they appeared to be slightly straight. Once I had gotten the slightly straight lines painted onto this cape, it was time to start putting the model together so that I could check that everything was working kind of according to plan. And so I used some super glue on this model because, again, I didn't feel like doing magnets or anything with this guy. The keys are big enough though for you to do magnets. Some models aren't, but in this case, this model, the sculptor made sure that the keys were big enough for you to put magnets, and you could easily magnetize a model like this. Now that I've got the model done and I know that everything is working how I want it to work, it's time to work on the portrait. And for this guy, I'm going to keep it fairly simple. We're going to start out with a dark reddish flesh tone first, and we're going to give it some shape and highlights with a slightly paler flesh tone over the top of that. We're going to use fairy flesh, which is really bright, and we're going to give some bright edges to the face. The reason I've gone simple like this is because the model is really small. It's not tiny, but it's by no means a large scale statue, so I didn't want to overdo the amount of work that is almost unnecessary at this scale. I used the patch and scratch and patch technique, you know, with the all 3 washes over the skin, and this gives it some texture and makes it feel a little bit more alive. And then for the hair, I just use a contrast paint over the top of that. The teeth, on the other hand, this took me wearing some glasses and a very small paintbrush and a very careful pinpointing of some deck tan over the top of a reddish kind of color in the inside of the mouth, just so that the teeth weren't just one solid block of white. Going back to the hair, I felt like the contrast paint on its own was not good enough to give it that depth that I wanted, so I used a skin tone, flesh kind of color that Ammo by Mig makes, and I just kind of edge highlighted areas. I just placed it in certain areas that I thought would give some highlight to the hair and a little bit more volume. I used reddish flesh over his lips to make them nice and voluptuous. Once I had done that, I also made sure to give them a gloss coat. I then repainted his eyes because I didn't like the way that I did them, and I used a black as the base with white over the top because this was the best way at this scale to make them stand out. I then totally cheated and used a pen on the eyes and then used a gloss over the top of them and placed the head on top of Homelander to call this model done. I hope that you took something out of this video that might help you paint the Homelander that you get, or maybe it just helps you paint something different in the future. And if it does, I hope you left a like and a subscribe, because for every new subscribe that I get, I will have one more new subscriber. Speaking of subscribers, I'd like to thank the Patreons who subscribed to my Patreon this last week. Franken3D, Craig Sommerfield, Joao Pereira Lima, and Ghost Made Gaming. Thank you, my dudes, for your Patreonage and keeping the light of the Patreon blind in my eyeballs, because without your help, I don't know if I could keep doing this, and I really do appreciate every single one of you. If you want to support the videos, then go watch another video, and leave a like and a subscribe and a word in the little square box. We know the drill. Also, if you want to support any further, check out the Patreon, and this is the time where I tell you if you don't like what you saw, I don't really care, and you can kindly just f*** off.